He looked up from the cockpit, visor still on, engine idling at the end of the pit lane, and what he saw in the grandstand on the far side of the pit straight made him go completely still inside his helmet. There were maybe 30 of them, clustered together in a section about 2/3 of the way up the grandstand, near the entrance to Turn 1, faces painted black, afro wigs sitting sideways on their heads, T-shirts that read "Hamilton's Family" in thick, mocking block letters. They were waving, laughing, making sounds in his direction that were not words. And in that moment, a 23-year-old man from Stevenage, England, the only black driver in the entire history of Formula One at the highest level, sat inside a machine that had cost more than $40 million to build, surrounded by the most commercially powerful racing organization on the planet, with a World Championship trophy from the previous season's title fight sitting in the McLaren factory back in Woking, and felt something he had not expected to feel here. He felt completely alone. What happened in the weeks and months and years after that February morning at the Circuit de Catalunya is a story that the world of Formula One spent a very long time hoping would stay private. It is a story about silence and what silence costs the person who has to live inside it. It is a story about a retired schoolteacher in Coventry who wrote a letter he wasn't sure would arrive. And it is a story about what happens when a man spends 12 years winning everything there is to win and then decides, deliberately, at real personal cost, in a sport that had never been designed with him in mind, that he is done absorbing what was never his to carry alone. What he built on the other side of that decision might genuinely surprise you. Let's go back to the beginning, not to February 2008, much further back than that. Stevenage, Hertfordshire, England. A mid-sized commuter town about 28 miles north of London. Not the sort of place you'd expect to produce a Formula One world champion. Stevenage doesn't have the rolling landscape of the Cotswolds or the cultural gravity of the capital. It was constructed in 1946 as one of Britain's first purpose-built new towns. Planned residential developments designed to rehouse people from bombed-out London neighbourhoods after the war. Rows of near-identical terraced houses, roundabouts at almost every junction, a pedestrian shopping centre in the centre of town that locals called the Old Town, with a degree of affection that the architecture didn't quite justify. Anthony Hamilton grew up in Stevenage. He worked as an IT manager for a railway company. He had Lewis at 22 with his then-girlfriend Carmen, and when their relationship ended, he raised Lewis himself. On weekends and school holidays at first, then more and more as Lewis got older and the arrangement between his parents found its shape. Anthony didn't have money in the way the motorsport world understands money. He drove second-hand cars and worked extra shifts when the bills required it, and he never discussed either of those facts with anyone if he could help it. What he discussed was Lewis, what Lewis needed, what Lewis was capable of, what Lewis would become if the right doors were in the right places at the right time. Lewis Hamilton was 8 years old when Anthony bought him his first radio-controlled car. Not a toy, exactly, a proper competitive RC racing model, the kind hobbyists take to dedicated tracks and run in organized heats. Lewis went to sleep reading the manual. He memorized torque specifications. He started winning races at local tracks within a few months. Anthony watched this with the careful attention of a man who had decided not to project what he was hoping to see, but who found himself seeing it anyway. There was something in the way Lewis interacted with the car that went beyond talent. It was a quality that Anthony couldn't quite name for a while. The machine and the boy seemed to be having a conversation that no one else was quite in on. At 9, Lewis moved to real karts, open-wheel machines, low to the ground, no suspension in the traditional sense, just a rigid chassis that communicates everything the track is doing directly through the seat of your race suit. Lewis felt immediately at home. He had an instinct for how much grip the rear tires were giving, for how close to the limit he could push before the physics stopped cooperating, that his early coaches consistently described with a version of the same phrase. He was 9, then 10, and he was doing things that drivers twice his age hadn't learned to do. He shouldn't be able to feel where the back end is about to step out at that speed. He shouldn't know how to manage tire wear at that age. He shouldn't be able to judge that gap. He shouldn't be able to do that yet. The award ceremony was in late 1995, junior karting, regional level. Anthony was there, which he always was. At the end of the evening, a 10-year-old Lewis Hamilton walked across the room to where Ron Dennis was standing. Ron Dennis, the CEO of the McLaren Formula One team, one of the most powerful figures in motorsport at that time, there as a guest of the event's sponsors. Lewis looked up at this man in his suit and said, with the composure of someone far older than he was, "Hello, I'm Lewis Hamilton." Ron Dennis looked at the kid, looked at the slight too large blazer, looked at the entirely serious face underneath it. He took out his notebook, wrote something down, and smiled. "Come and find me in 9 years," he said. He wasn't joking. 9 years later, McLaren signed Lewis to their young driver development program. But to get there, Anthony Hamilton had to do something that almost no father in the history of the sport had done from that starting point. He had to fund it. Every karting campaign, every set of tyres, every entry fee, every travel cost, in the years before the McLaren program officially began, this was on Anthony. He drove Lewis to tracks across the country on Saturdays and stood in the rain watching timing screens, and he did it without asking Lewis to be grateful about it, because he understood, in the way very few parents do, that gratitude is not what a young driver needs in those years. Focus is what a young driver needs. Belief, the freedom to go as fast as the car will allow without the weight of obligation sitting on the passenger seat. He also had a different conversation with Lewis, more than once. He sat him down and explained the specific geography of the world Lewis was entering. Formula One, Anthony said, had never had a black driver succeed at the front of the grid. The paddock, the teams, the sponsors, the media, these were institutions built over decades by people who looked a certain way, and they had their own expectations about what success looked like and who was entitled to it. Some people, he said carefully, are going to make that obvious to you, not all of them, but some, and when they do, the answer is not anger in the moment, the answer is the work, the result, the next fastest lap, because a result they cannot argue with is more powerful than anything you could say in response to them. He looked at Lewis. "You understand what I'm telling you?" Lewis was quiet. Then, "Yeah, Dad." He understood. He just didn't yet know what that instruction would cost him to keep. McLaren's young driver program moved Lewis through every rung of the junior categories with unusual speed. Formula Renault, Formula 3, GP2, the second division of the sport's official ladder, which Lewis won in his debut season in 2006, with an authority that made the team principals who'd been watching the feeder series sit up slightly straighter in their chairs. He arrived in Formula One in 2007 already known, already measured, already carrying a reputation that created expectations he hadn't been asked whether he wanted to carry. His teammate was Fernando Alonso, double world champion, one of the greatest drivers of his generation, and, in 2007, the most decorated active driver in the sport. Alonso had come to McLaren expecting to lead. The hierarchy was clear in his mind before the first wheel turned in anger. He was the champion. The new kid was there to support the effort, learn the machinery, contribute data, and, in 2 or 3 years maybe, develop into a competitor. That was how the script was supposed to read. Lewis Hamilton didn't read it. He outqualified Alonso in Australia. He matched him in Malaysia. By Canada, he was on the top step of the podium for the first time in his career, and by the 3rd month of the season, the relationship between the two drivers had moved from competitive to genuinely hostile. There were team radio messages. There were private confrontations that found their way into the press. There were accusations of preferential treatment from both sides, and there was, layered underneath all of it, a particular quality of friction that you get when a man who has been told he is the best encounters evidence to the contrary from a direction he didn't anticipate. Formula One that year was already embroiled in a wider scandal. McLaren were found to have been in possession of confidential technical data from Ferrari, which resulted in a $100 million fine and the exclusion of the team from the Constructors' Championship. It was a season of extraordinary talent and extraordinary chaos simultaneously. And through all of it, Lewis Hamilton raced. He led the Drivers' Championship for most of the year. He came to the final race in Brazil needing a single point. He didn't get it, lost the title by 1 point to Kimi Raikkonen of Ferrari, and drove back to the paddock with a composure that people who were there described as almost unsettling. Not because he seemed not to care, because it was absolutely clear that he cared enormously and had decided that this was not the place where that was going to show. By the end of 2007, Alonso had left McLaren. Lewis Hamilton returned as the clear team leader, the future of the program, 23 years old and already in his second season as a front-running championship contender, which brought him to February of 2008. Pre-season testing, the Circuit de Catalunya, Montmeló, north of Barcelona. Testing sessions in Formula One are quiet affairs compared to race weekends. There's no broadcast, no big public attendance, no podium. Teams run their cars in rotation, installation laps, fuel runs, tyre compound comparisons, qualifying simulations. Engineers cluster around laptops and timing screens in the garage. Drivers get in and out of the car at measured intervals and debrief in technical language about balance and downforce and braking points. It is serious, focused work. The stands were partially filled. Testing pulls smaller crowds than races, mostly enthusiasts who understand enough about the sport to find tyre degradation data interesting, and fans who want to see the new cars before the season begins without paying race weekend prices. And then there was that section. Lewis was in the garage when one of his engineers walked over and spoke to him quietly. Dave Robson, who had worked with the team for several years, described what he'd seen in the grandstand: the faces, the wigs, the shirts, the gestures being directed at the pit lane. Lewis was silent for a moment. He looked at a point somewhere on the garage floor. Then he looked back up. "All right," he said. He put his helmet on. What he saw when he came around to the main straight on his first installation lap, the grandstand section visible to his left, elevated above the pit wall, the group laughing and pointing and performing their version of what a black man was, is something he has described in various interviews over the years, never in quite the same words but always arriving at the same essential detail. The image stayed, not because of its violence exactly, but because of its clarity. Because it showed him precisely what certain people in that environment thought of him when they were not required to be polite about it. And because around him, in the paddock, in the pit lane, in the hospitality units and media centre and team garages, nobody said anything. Not publicly, not loudly, not in a way that would cost them even a sentence of discomfort. I want to sit with that for a second, because it's easy to move past it. There were journalists present at that test. There were team personnel from multiple organizations, mechanics, engineers, strategists, press officers, team principals. There were FIA officials whose job it was to oversee the sporting conduct of the event. There were circuit employees who had let these people into the grandstand and could have removed them. There were driver managers and sponsor representatives and camera operators from broadcast partners. All of these people could see the same grandstand that Lewis Hamilton could see from his cockpit when he came around to the main straight. And the institutional response, the combined, collective response of Formula One as a system on that day and in the days immediately following, was, essentially, to let the young man figure it out. That is not an accident. It is not an oversight. Institutions do not accidentally fail to respond to racism. They make choices in boardrooms and press offices and PR meetings about what kind of response would cost too much and what kind of silence they can sustain without it becoming their problem. Formula One, in February of 2008, calculated that the silence was sustainable. They were right, for a while. Lewis Hamilton let them be right. He had been taught to let them be right, because fighting it in public at 23 would have cost him more than he had to spend. That calculation, the unspoken, ongoing, exhausting calculation of how much to absorb and when, is something that almost nobody in the Formula One paddock ever had to make, except him. Not about this. Not about being the only person who looked like him in every room he entered, every garage he walked into, every press conference he sat down at, every podium he stood on. Other drivers had their own pressures, their own political navigations, their own moments of institutional failure, but this specific weight belonged to Lewis alone, and the sport that benefited from his talent and his marketability and his face on merchandise and his story in broadcast packages did not, in February 2008, choose to share it with him. Understand what that required of him day to day. That was the unwritten deal. You can be here and be celebrated here and make the sport money here, but you manage what it costs you to be here. Don't bring it into the room. The official statements that emerged were measured to the point of meaninglessness. The FIA expressed concern. Nobody was expelled from the facility. Nobody faced a ban. Nobody in an official capacity stood in a public setting and said, "This is a racist attack on a human being, and the people responsible for it will not be welcome in this sport." Fernando Alonso was asked about it at a press conference that week. He said he was not aware of the group, had nothing to do with it, and that fans were entitled to express their support however they chose. He was speaking in the context of his own complicated history with Lewis and with the previous season's acrimony, and his comment was technically true, and it was also, at that specific moment, knowing what was being described, a choice that communicated something. People who are paying attention know what a choice to say nothing costs, and what not making it costs the person who was hoping someone would. That night after the incident, Lewis Hamilton sat in his hotel room with his phone off. He didn't call Anthony. He sat at the desk near the window and looked out at the lights of Barcelona spread below him, and he felt the particular exhaustion of a person who has just absorbed something they cannot fully process yet, while knowing they have to be back in a race car at 7 the following morning. He had eaten dinner at the team hotel with some of the engineers, and they had discussed the car's behavior on the soft compound tires and whether the front wing specification from the afternoon session was worth carrying into the next day or reverting to the baseline. He had held his part of the conversation and contributed to the technical debrief and said goodnight to the engineers at the elevator bank. Then he had gone upstairs and sat at the desk. He called Anthony the next morning briefly. They talked about the car, about whether the tyre data from the day suggested they were in good shape for the first race of the season, or whether the engine's power delivery on cold tracks was going to require further work. 12 minutes on the phone. Lewis said he'd call again in a few days. Then he went back to the track. He drove his laps. He debriefed with the engineers. He was fast, which he almost always was, and professional, which he had been taught to be, and he held inside him what that week had given him with the same discipline Anthony had spent a decade installing, not because the discipline was comfortable, but because it was the only available strategy for remaining in a room that had not decided to protect him. He won the World Championship in 2008. On the last corner of the last lap of the last race in Interlagos, Brazil, he passed Timo Glock of Toyota in the final sector to take the fifth-place finish he needed. By 1 point, Lewis Hamilton became world champion, the youngest in the sport's history at that time and the first black world champion in 6 decades of Formula One. He stood on the podium in Sao Paulo with the trophy and the confetti falling under the stadium lights. And he was 23 years old, and Barcelona was 4 months behind him, and if you watched his face carefully during the anthem, you could see a person who was present and somewhere else at the same time. The years between 2008 and 2013 were years of excellence that got complicated reviews. Lewis won races and finished on podiums and had championship battles that went to the final races of the season, and the coverage of him was consistently inflected with something that was hard to pin down precisely. There was always a qualifier ready. A caveat, a reason to hedge the admiration. He was too aggressive, he was too emotional, he made mistakes under pressure. The car was better than him. His teammates weren't strong enough to test him. The analyses were not always wrong, but they were applied with a consistency and an enthusiasm that other drivers in equivalent situations didn't quite attract. He moved to Mercedes in 2013, and what happened next is either a story about being in the right place at the right time, or a story about reading a technical situation with the intuition of a man who understood racing machinery on a level that most people around him were only beginning to appreciate. The car was not yet dominant. The regulations that would make it dominant were coming, and Lewis saw the engineering culture of the team and made a calculation. He left McLaren, the only team he'd ever raced for, the institution that had shaped him as a driver from the age of 13, and took the risk. By 2014, the Mercedes hybrid power unit was a generation ahead of the competition, and Lewis drove it with a precision and a strategic intelligence and a qualifying pace that gradually became almost impossible to credibly dismiss. He won in 2014, in 2015, in 2017, 2018, 2019, 7 World Championships total, tying Michael Schumacher's all-time record in 2020. The most race wins in the history of the sport, the most pole positions, the most points accumulated. Numbers that constitute the statistical case for the greatest Formula One driver who ever lived, and which were met by significant sections of the media and fan base with a persistent creativity in identifying reasons why the numbers didn't quite count. The best car argument. The teammate argument, the regulation argument, the various methods by which human beings, when confronted with evidence that contradicts something they had already decided, find ways to complicate the evidence rather than update the conclusion. Lewis Hamilton understood this pattern. He had been navigating some version of it since he was 14 years old. He kept driving. He kept stacking the numbers. He understood that the argument from results is one that eventually becomes very hard to sustain against. But he was also carrying something heavier over those years than any championship battle. He was carrying the accumulated weight of being the person in the room who was never supposed to be the person in the room, and of having to behave as though that weight didn't exist in order to be taken seriously by the very people responsible for the weight. It is an exhausting position. It requires a particular kind of daily performance that doesn't show up in lap times or qualifying pace, the performance of being acceptable in a space that wasn't designed for you, of smiling at sponsor events and being gracious in defeat and measured in victory, and never, in any public forum, being as angry as the situation actually warrants. He managed it. For a long time, he managed it extraordinarily well, and then in June of 2020, everything changed. George Floyd, Minneapolis. The footage that spread across every screen on the planet within hours, replayed and replayed until it became the kind of image that requires an active effort not to see. The protests that followed, hundreds of cities, dozens of countries, every time zone, a simultaneity of grief and rage that had no precedent in the social media era and that forced certain institutions to take positions they had been successfully avoiding for decades. Formula One was preparing to restart its COVID-interrupted season, focused on logistics and protocols and the commercial pressures of getting the calendar back on track. And then June arrived, and everyone was watching something else. Lewis Hamilton, the most famous black athlete in a sport where he remained the only black competitor at the highest level, did something that the sport had spent over a decade hoping he wouldn't do. He stopped managing it. He posted things that didn't have the carefully calibrated language of the previous 12 years. He called out the silence of his colleagues directly, by name and by implication. He said that Formula One had a racism problem. He said that those who were staying quiet were complicit in the silence. He said, in one interview that was widely replayed, that he felt more alone in those days than he had expected to feel, even knowing what the sport was. And then, at every race through the remainder of the 2020 season, he knelt on one knee on the starting grid before the lights went out. Some drivers knelt with him, some stood nearby, some stood elsewhere. One driver made a public statement about why he chose not to kneel, which generated its own significant press cycle. The conversation that the sport had been avoiding for 60 years was now, unavoidably, in the room. And it was there because Lewis Hamilton had used the access that 7 world championships had given him, the access that no previous black driver had ever had, that no previous black person in the paddock at any level had ever had, to force a door open that institutions are very good at keeping politely, professionally, permanently closed. The Hamilton Commission was announced in 2020. A research and advocacy initiative focused on the underrepresentation of black people in British motorsport. A real piece of work, not a social media statement, not a logo on a livery. Actual research, actual recommendations, actual commitments from partner organisations. It published its report in July 2020 and found, among many other things, that black people made up approximately 1% of the workforce in UK motorsport. 1%. In a country where approximately 3% of the population is black or black British. The pipeline didn't just have barriers. In many places, the pipeline didn't meaningfully exist. Now, here is the part of this story that most people don't know. In January of 2009, 4 months before the start of the new Formula One season, about 14 months after the Barcelona testing incident, Lewis Hamilton received a handwritten letter. It came through his management office and was flagged to him directly. The sender was a man named Marcus Webb from Coventry. He was 61 years old. He was a retired secondary school physical education teacher. He was not connected to the motorsport industry in any professional capacity. He was black. Marcus Webb had seen the footage of the Barcelona incident on a news broadcast. His wife had called him in from the garden. He had watched, on a small television in their living room, the brief clip of the grandstand, the faces, the wigs, the shirts. He had, later that year, watched Lewis Hamilton win the World Championship and give his post-race interview on the Interlagos podium with the same composed, managed quality that Marcus had been watching all season. And he had sat in his chair afterward and felt something settle in his chest that was not quite sadness and not quite anger. It was more specific than either of those things. It was the feeling, he wrote in the letter, of watching someone absorb a punch in front of a crowd that looked away. He wrote the letter over 3 evenings. He sat at the kitchen table after his wife had gone to bed, under the overhead light, on paper he'd taken from a writing set that had been in a drawer since Christmas of some previous year. Not because it was difficult to write, he knew what he wanted to say, but because he was 61 years old and believed that some communications deserved the time it took to get them right. He had spent his entire career reading the work of students who treated writing as something to be done as quickly as possible and moved past. He didn't believe in doing it that way himself. He wrote about what it meant to see Lewis on a Formula One grid for the first time. He described watching the opening race of the 2007 season on the television and understanding, in the first few minutes, that something had shifted in the world in a way that was going to matter to a specific category of people, most of whom no one had thought to ask. He wrote about his own experiences, 30 years teaching in British secondary schools, coaching youth athletics and football and whatever else the timetable required, moving through institutions where the staff photographs on the entrance hall walls had a consistency of composition that no one in authority had ever seemed to consider worth examining. He wrote about what it had cost individual students over those years to excel in environments that communicated through 100 small textures, that excelling was unexpected. He had watched those students absorb that communication and keep going. He had enormous respect for their endurance and enormous anger at the requirement. He wrote about February in Barcelona with a directness that was not angry and not sentimental. He said, "What happened to you that week was wrong," and then he wrote the specific thing that most people in that situation would have edited out before sending. He wrote, "I watched the sports response, and I know what that response was, and I want you to know that it was not acceptable, and that someone is telling you so even if the people with the power to change it are not." And then he wrote about something else. In the 1990s, Marcus Webb had run a youth motorsport initiative through a local council program in Coventry, karting for young people from backgrounds that didn't typically produce racing drivers, not because they lacked talent, but because the entry costs were prohibitive and the culture of the sport had never been designed to make them feel welcome. The program had been funded through a combination of local government grants and small private donations, and Marcus had run it for 8 years with a group of volunteer coaches and a van that he drove to the track himself on Saturday mornings with equipment in the back. In 2001, the funding was cut. Budget pressures, reallocation priorities, the usual institutional language for the decision to stop spending money on something that was working but that nobody powerful enough was watching. Marcus had spent the years since trying to get it reinstated. Grant applications, council meetings, letters to local MPs, conversations with businesses about sponsorship. Slowly, piece by piece, he had managed to partially restart the program. Not at the scale it had been, but enough to run sessions, enough to put kids in carts, enough to give a 13-year-old in Coventry the experience of sitting in a racing seat and discovering whether they had something worth developing. He did not know if any of it would produce a Formula One driver. He did not think it mattered whether it did. He thought it mattered that the door existed. He wrote all of this to Lewis. And then, near the end of the letter, he wrote something that he said in 2023 he still wasn't sure he should have included. He wrote, "I don't know what use any of this is to you. I don't expect a reply. I just wanted you to know that there is someone in Coventry who has spent 30 years trying to make sure the next Lewis Hamilton doesn't have to feel what you felt that week." He included his address, just in case. Lewis Hamilton was 24 years old when he read that letter. He was in the middle of the 2009 season, managing a new car, working within a team structure that demanded most of his available attention and which left little room for the kind of extended personal reflection that a letter like this invites. His management team was cautious about personal correspondence. A world champion receives enormous quantities of mail, some of which is genuinely complicated, some of which needs to be handled with legal care, and the instinct of the people around him was to protect his time and his mental space during a season. But Lewis read this letter. He read it the way you read something when you know 3 sentences in that it is not like the others. He read it twice. He set it on the desk in front of him and looked at the address at the top, a terraced house in Coventry, a street name, a postcode, and thought about the man who had sat down at his kitchen table to write something that had no guaranteed audience and no obvious personal benefit. He told a journalist in 2023 that what the letter gave him, in a way he didn't quite have the language for at the time, was a specific thing that he had not expected to receive from that world. Not sympathy, not admiration, something more precise than either. It was the experience of someone seeing what had actually happened, not the managed version, not the disappointing incident version, and responding to the real thing, responding to it without being asked, without a platform, without any structural reason to bother, just because they had seen it and couldn't move past it without saying something. He didn't write back immediately. The season was full, and the caution around correspondence was real, but he kept the letter. He put it in a drawer, then in a folder. More than a decade later, in 2020, when Lewis Hamilton set up the Hamilton Commission, he assembled a small research team. One of the advisors brought on in the early phase, a person whose job was to help the Commission understand what effective grassroots youth motorsport programs actually looked like when they were built outside the traditional institutional structures, was a retired PE teacher and youth karting coordinator from Coventry named Marcus Webb. He was 72 years old. He had kept going with the program through the intervening years, through funding gaps and volunteer fatigue, and the particular challenge of running something that the people who controlled the money had never quite decided was worth fully supporting. He had kept going because he had decided, in 1995 or so, that this was the work, not a phase of it, the work itself. When Lewis's team called Marcus to ask whether he'd be willing to be interviewed for the commission's research, he agreed immediately. Then they asked whether he remembered writing a letter in 2009. There was a pause. "I didn't think that went anywhere," Marcus said. "The researcher said, it went somewhere. Lewis wants you to know that." Marcus Webb went home after that phone call and sat in the kitchen for a while, without immediately explaining to his wife what had happened. He made a cup of tea and let it go cold on the table in front of him. He sat there for a while, in the way you sit when something has occurred that you need to hold still for a moment before it becomes ordinary. She came in at some point and found him there. "You're doing that face," she said. He told her. She sat down across from him, and they looked at each other across the kitchen table, the same light, and there was a pause of a specific kind that only happens between two people who have been in the same house for 30-something years. 11 years, she said. He nodded. 11 years, he said. The Hamilton Commission report, published in July 2020, contained 30 specific recommendations addressing the structural barriers to black participation in UK motorsport: curriculum, funding pathways, grassroots infrastructure, employer commitments, mentorship structures, school outreach. Several major motorsport organisations, a number of UK universities with engineering programmes, and Formula One itself committed to taking steps toward implementing specific recommendations. Not a press release. A document with 30 numbered items and a timeline and named organisations attached to each commitment. Marcus Webb's name appeared in the acknowledgements, not in the main text, not on the cover, not in the executive summary. A paragraph near the back among several names of community practitioners whose long-term local work had informed the Commission's understanding of what effective programs could look like. It was 3 sentences. He said to his wife that it was the most he'd ever wanted from anything like this, and also that he hadn't known until he read it. At the Commission's launch event in London, Marcus was in the room. He sat near the back, which he said was practical, better sightlines to the presentation slides. Lewis Hamilton stood at the podium and delivered remarks that were partly prepared and partly not. He talked about the early years. He talked about what the sport had not done when it had the chance to do it. He talked about what it had cost, specifically, to be the person who had to keep absorbing what was not his to absorb, while continuing to perform at a level that left no room for the anger he was actually carrying. And then he said, there are people in this room who were doing this work before there was a commission, before there was any public attention on it, before it cost them anything to stay quiet instead. They were building things in community centres and on wet Saturday mornings at local tracks, and in letters they wrote to people they had no particular reason to believe were listening. They did it because it was right. He didn't say Marcus's name from the podium. He hadn't planned to, and he didn't. But after the formal program ended, during the reception, he walked directly across the room. Not stopped, not redirected, directly across the room to where Marcus Webb was standing with a glass of water and a name badge. Lewis shook his hand and held it. Marcus looked at him. Marcus went home to Coventry that night on the train. His wife met him at the station. She asked how it was. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about the question with some seriousness. "It was good," he said. She studied his face. "You're doing that face again," she said. He laughed this time. "I know," he said. The Hamilton Commission's work did not transform Formula One overnight. No report does. The pipeline is long and expensive, and the structural barriers that had been accumulating over 6 decades are not dismantled by a framework document and a set of organisational commitments, however sincere. Lewis Hamilton knows this. He has said so in interviews with a directness that he has increasingly allowed himself, a quality of plain speech that used to be absent from his public communication and that now seems simply to be who he is. He said in a 2022 interview, "The sport is better than it was. It is not yet what it needs to be. But here is what has materially changed. There are now 8 youth motorsport development programs in the United Kingdom, specifically designed to reach black and other underrepresented communities, 3 of which received startup funding or organisational support, traceable at least partially to advocacy that grew out of the Commission's recommendations. Employers in the paddock are reporting and being held to reported numbers on diversity in their hiring. Engineers from underrepresented backgrounds who joined the sport in the years immediately following the Commission's publication exist. Not in large numbers, not nearly enough, but they exist in a way they did not exist before. A thing that was invisible is now being counted. A thing that was not counted was not in any meaningful sense being addressed. Marcus Webb still goes to the track on Saturday mornings. He is 75 now. He wears a yellow high-visibility vest he has owned for more than a decade and carries the same aluminum clipboard with the timing sheet attached. Last autumn, a 14-year-old girl from the east side of Coventry won her age category at a regional junior karting series. She had been in his program for 2 years. Her coaches describe her with a phrase that has been used about talented young drivers in karting for as long as the sport has existed. A phrase that echoes across different coaches in different eras without any of them quite realizing they're using the same words. Lewis Hamilton was knighted in 2021. Sir Lewis Hamilton. The ceremony was at Windsor Castle. He wore a suit in a pale silver grey and knelt on the velvet cushion and received the honour with the composure that has been the consistent external register of his public life. Managed, contained, performed without performance being visible. He has said that the honour meant a great deal to him. He has also said, with the plain directness that has become his register in the years since 2020, that he wishes the sport that produced him had been readier to deserve him earlier. There is one more thing. In 2023, Lewis attended an event for one of the Hamilton Commission's partner programs at a karting circuit in the Midlands. It was a Saturday morning in September, overcast, the kind of grey English morning that flattens the light and makes the colours of race suits and kart bodywork look more vivid than they would in sunshine. He arrived in a dark hoodie with sunglasses on and moved through the paddock area without immediately being identified. The crowd was small, mostly parents and program coaches and a handful of spectators who'd found out the event was happening through the program's social media. He stood at the trackside barrier for a long time, just watching. He watched the junior heats cycle through, each driver running their 3 laps, the times going up on the screen at the end of the pit lane. He watched a boy in a yellow helmet come out of a long right-hander slightly sideways, the rear stepping out on the damp track surface, catch it with a small, clean correction and accelerate hard onto the back straight. Lewis leaned toward the person standing next to him, one of the program's lead coordinators, a woman who had been running youth sessions for 8 years. "That kid has something," he said. She nodded. "His dad drives him 40 minutes each way every Saturday morning," she said. "Works nights Monday through Friday." Lewis looked back at the track. The yellow helmet was coming around again, tucked low through the fast left at the end of the back straight. He didn't speak for a moment. Then, yeah. He stayed for 3 hours. He watched every heat. He signed things and took photographs and talked to kids who were waiting for the track to come alive under them, the way it had once come alive under him. He shook Marcus Webb's hand again at the end of the day. Lewis smiled, not the managed smile, the actual one. "That was always the idea," he said. "There is a photograph from that day, taken by someone on their phone, blurry the way phone photographs taken in the middle of something real tend to be blurry, not centered, not composed. Lewis is standing at the barrier with his arms folded, turned slightly to watch a cart coming through the corner. His face is not performing anything, he is simply watching. In the background, slightly out of focus, a 14-year-old girl in a white helmet is lined up at the start line, waiting for the green. She doesn't know anyone is photographing her. She doesn't know who is standing 30 feet to her left. She is just waiting for the light to change. This is what Formula One spent a long time not understanding about Lewis Hamilton. The sport is very good at recording certain things. Championship tallies, race wins, fastest laps, pole position counts that run into the triple digits, pit stop times measured in fractions of seconds. The gap at the line, the delta on the tyre data, the tenths of a second that separate championship from almost championship over a 30-plus race season. These numbers follow his name into history books and broadcast packages and Wikipedia articles and will continue to follow it for as long as people care about the sport. The record is comprehensive and it is real, and it represents something genuinely extraordinary about what one human being can do with a steering wheel and 40 years of accumulated technical knowledge built from the age of 8. The sport is considerably less practiced at recording what it costs to produce those numbers from the specific starting point of being the only person in the building who looked like him, year after year, for the entire duration of a career that has now outlasted every other career in the sport's history. Lewis Hamilton won 7 world championships in an institution that didn't know what to do with him from the first season he arrived. He sat in a cockpit at the Circuit de Catalunya in February 2008 and looked up at a grandstand and felt completely alone, and he went back to the track the next morning and drove his laps, and he spent 12 years accumulating titles that couldn't be taken from him, and then he spent the next 12 years using every ounce of the access those titles had earned him to force a conversation that the institution had been managing to avoid for 60 years. And in Coventry, a retired teacher wrote a letter on actual paper in actual handwriting and left his address at the bottom, just in case. The letter arrived. Lewis kept it. He kept it for 11 years, and when he built something real, not a statement, not a logo, something with research and recommendations and named commitments and accountability attached, the man who wrote the letter was in the room. Everything went somewhere. That is the truth of it. Not immediately, not in the first year, or the 5th, or even the 10th. But the letter arrived. It stayed in a drawer. And when the moment came, when a man had accumulated enough championships and enough platform and enough of the sport's own undeniable numbers to be impossible to silence, the thing that had been waiting in the drawer came out and became part of what was built. That is how it tends to work. Not quickly, not visibly, but it works. If this story moved you, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell me about someone who wrote the letter. Someone who showed up before anyone was watching, who built something before it was the right thing to say, who kept going through the years when nobody with any power was paying attention. I'll read every one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Maybe they're in the middle of absorbing something that was never theirs to carry alone. Maybe they just need to know that the quiet work doesn't disappear. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you're here for the next story, because this channel exists for exactly these people. The ones the official records forget to mention, the ones who were there anyway.